And your inventory is water. I grew up surrounded by water.
Boba Fett, son of the notorious bounty hunter Jango Fett.
I grew up surrounded by
Bounty hunter.
And it is that moment when you are no longer a cadet. You are a soldier.
I grew up surrounded by
Cadet.
Today, you'll see how a real working Jedi cruiser operates.
I grew up surrounded by
Jedi cruiser.
Ready to receive Code 5 transmission.
I grew up surrounded by
Transmission. Post-combined sparking off the reactor core rod, sir.
I grew up surrounded by
Reactor core.
This doesn't look like a drill.
I grew up surrounded by
Drill.
The young Boba Fett has taken the law into his own hand.
I grew up surrounded by
The law.
Boba was on Geonosis when his father died. He watched as I killed him.
I grew up surrounded by
Geonosis.
General Windu's quarters got hit, but he survived.
I grew up surrounded by
Quarters.
Watcher, this is Boba. It's a miss. Repeat, miss. What should I do?
I grew up surrounded by
Miss. But the crew. It isn't about them. Just Mace.
I grew up surrounded by
The crew. I'll return to my company.
I grew up surrounded by
Company.
I need an
Is that a
escort for cadet back to his
DC-15A?
group.
I grew up surrounded by
DC-15A?
We are pretty overloaded with the emergency status.
I grew up surrounded by
Emergency status.
We're brothers. Don't shoot.
You're not my brother.
I grew up surrounded by
Not my brother.
Lucky. Stay with the group.
I grew up surrounded by
The group.
Port's malfunction.
I grew up surrounded by
Malfunction.
That was never part of the plan. I just wanted to kill the Jedi that murdered my father.
I grew up surrounded by
The plan. You haven't even done anything. I've taken all the risks.
I grew up surrounded by
Risks.
That does not sit well with the young vigilante.
I grew up surrounded by
Vigilante.
Count Dooku will pay us well if we bring back the Jedi's head.
I grew up surrounded by
Count Dooku.
You'll get one shot at this, kid.
I grew up surrounded by
One shot. Nice work, kid.
I grew up surrounded by
Nice work.
Boba's mentor, bounty hunter Aura Singh.
I grew up surrounded by
Aura Singh.
Next time I tell you to pull the trigger, you do it.
I grew up surrounded by
Do it. We're going to visit an old friend.
I grew up surrounded by
An old friend. I never asked for permission to do anything, my darling.
I grew up surrounded by
My darling.
Let us go inside where we can discuss business over a drink.
I grew up surrounded by
Business. You are in an interesting predicament once again.
I grew up surrounded by
Predicament.
We can do this the difficult way or the simple way.
I grew up surrounded by
The difficult way.
I'm not a murderer, but I want justice.
I grew up surrounded by
Justice. You stole a bounty from me, and I want an apology.
I grew up surrounded by
An apology.
Paid off the kid to create a diversion.
I grew up surrounded by
Diversion.
Do not open this box.
You make the rules. I follow them.
I grew up surrounded by
The rules. There. I'll be in the engine with Bosk. I sent the new girl and Denga to the back.
I grew up surrounded by
Bosk. I'll check the cargo. Stay here.
I grew up surrounded by
The cargo.
You have no idea who you are talking to.
I grew up surrounded by
No idea.
No one can train you for the moment. You look death in the eyes.
I grew up surrounded by
Death.
Watch out!